Okay, I literally just finished reading chapter 40, so I don't have to refresh my memory on what happened. But I am mad at Kale because I don't know if I don't know what he's doing. Okay, so we found out. Okay, let me just brief y'all through what happened through chapter 40 because I'm kind of scared for Selena now that those freaking, I don't even know what they are, the maid things that Rolf said that him and his men saw are going to Wendelin. So yeah, I'm scared for Selena. Kale is refusing to fight. Surprise, surprise. I'm mad. I'm very disappointed in Kale right now. I really thought he would step up, and he's not. And Adian was 100% right about why he's not doing what he needs to be doing. So whatever. I'm just disappointed. Anyway, we'll go ahead and get started. We are on chapter 41, page 353. And yeah, let's see. Oh, now I'm scared. All right. The next 2 weeks fell into a pattern, enough that Selena started to find comfort in it. There were no unexpected stumbles or turns or pitfalls. No deaths or betrayals or nightmares made flesh. In the mornings and evenings, she played scullery maid. Late morning until dinner she spent with Rowan, slowly, painfully exploring the well of magic inside her, a well that, to her horror, had no bottom in sight. The small things, lighting candles, putting out hearth fires, weaving a ribbon of flame through her fingers, were still the hardest, but Rowan pushed, dragging her from ruin to ruin, the only safe places for her to lose control. At least he brought food with him now, as she was constantly starving and could hardly go an hour without eating something. Magic gobbled up energy, and she was eating double or triple what she used to. Sometimes they would talk. Well, she would make him talk, because after telling him about Adian and her own selfish wish for freedom, she decided that talking was good, even if she wasn't able to open up about some things. Like, she liked hearing Rowan speak. She managed to get him to tell her about his various campaigns and adventures, each more brutal and harrowing than the next. There was a whole giant world to the south and east of Wendelin, kingdoms and empires she'd heard of in passing, but had never known much about. Rowan was a true warrior, who had walked on and off of killing fields, led men through hell, sailed on raging seas, and seen distant, strange shores. Though she envied his long life, and the gift of seeing the world that went along with it, she could still feel the undercurrent of rage and grief beneath each tale, the loss of his mate that haunted him no matter how far he rode or sailed or flew. He spoke very little of his friends, who sometimes accompanied him on his journeys. She did not envy him in the battles he had fought. The wars in far-off lands, or the bloody years spent laying siege to cities of sand and stone. She did not tell him that, of course. She only listened as he narrated while instructing her. And as she listened, she began to hate Maeve, truly hate her aunt in her core. The rage drove her to request legends about her aunt from Emery's every night. Rowan never reprimanded her when she asked for those stories, never showed any alarm. It came as some surprise when Emrys announced one day that Beltane was 2 days off, and they would begin preparations for their feasting and dancing and celebrating. Already Beltane, and according to Rowan, she was still far from ready to go to Dornell, despite mastering the shift. Spring would now be in full bloom on her own continent. Maypoles would be raised, hawthorn bushes decorated. That was about as much as the king would allow. There would be no small gifts left at crossroads for the little folk. The king permitted the bare bones only, with the focus squarely on the gods and planting for the harvest, not a hint or whisper of magic. Bonfires would be ignited, and a few brave souls would jump across for luck, to ward off evil, to ensure a good crop, whatever they hoped would come of it. As a child, she had run rampant through the field before the gates of Orinth, the 1,000 bonfires burning like the lights of the invading army that would too soon be encamped around the White City. It was her night, her mother had said, a night when a fire-bearing girl had nothing to fear, no powers to hide. Aelin Fireheart, people had whispered as she bounded past, embers streaming from her like ribbons. Adian and a few of her more lethal court members trailing as indulgent guards, Aelin of the Wildfire. After days of helping Emrys with the food and devouring it when the cook wasn't looking, she was hoping for a chance to relax on Beltane, but Rowan hauled her to a field atop the mountain plateau. Selena bit into an apple she pulled from her pocket and raised her brows at Rowan, who was standing in front of a massive pile of wood for the bonfire, flanked by 2 small unlit fires on either side. Around them, some of the demi-fae were still hauling in more wood and kindling, others setting up tables to serve the food that Emrys had been laboring over without rest. Dozens of other demi-fae had arrived from their various outposts, while little fanfare and much embracing and good-natured teasing. Between helping Emrys and training with Rowan, Selena hardly had time to inspect them, though a wretched part of her was somewhat pleased by the few admiring glances she caught being thrown in her direction, by the visiting males. She didn't fail to notice how quickly they looked away when they beheld Rowan at her side, though she did catch a few females looking at him with far warmer interest. She wanted to claw their faces off for it. She munched on the apple as she studied him now, in his usual pale gray tunic and wide belt, hood thrown back, and leather vambraces gleaming in the late afternoon sunlight. God, she had no interest in him like that, and she was certain he had no inclination to take her to his bed either. Maybe it was just from spending so much time in her fey body that she felt territorial and grumpy and mean. Last night she had growled at a female in the kitchen who would not stop staring at him and had actually taken a step toward him as if to say hello. Selena shook her head to clear away the instincts that were starting to make her see fire at all hours of the day. I assume you brought me here so I could practice? She chucked the apple core across the field and rubbed at her shoulder. She had been feverish the night before, thanks to Rowan making her practice all afternoon, and had awoken exhausted this morning. Ignite them, and keep the fires controlled and even all night. All 3. Not a question. Keep the end ones low for the jumpers. The middle one should be scorching the clouds. She wished she hadn't eaten the apple. This could easily turn lethal. He lifted a hand and wind stirred around her. I'll be here, he said, eyes shining with an arrogance he'd more than earned in his centuries of living. And if I somehow still manage to turn someone into a living torch, then it's a good thing the healers are also here to celebrate. She gave him a dirty look and rolled her shoulders. When do you want to start? Her stomach clenched as he said, now. She was burning, but remaining steady, even as the sun set and the field became packed with revelers. Musicians took up places by the forest edge, and the world filled with their violins and fiddles and flutes and drums. Such beautiful, ancient music that her flames moved with it, turning into rubies and citrines and tiger eyes and deepest sapphires. Her magic didn't manifest in only blue wildfire anymore. It had been slowly changing, growing these past few weeks. No one really noticed her, standing on the outskirts of the fire's light, though a few marveled at the flames that burned but did not consume the wood. Sweat ran down every part of her, mostly thanks to the terror of people jumping over the low-burning bonfires. Yet Rowan remained beside her, murmuring as if she were a nervous horse. She wanted to tell him to go away, to maybe indulge one of those doe-eyed females who kept silently inviting him to dance. But she focused on the flames and on maintaining that shred of control, even though her blood was starting to boil. A knot tightened in her lower back, and she shifted. God, she was soaked. Every damn crevice was damp. Easy, Rowan said as the flames danced a little higher. I know, she gritted out. The music was already so inviting, the dancing around the fire so joyous, the food on the table smelling so delicious. And here she was, far from it all, just burning. Her stomach rumbled. When can I stop? She shifted on her feet again, and the largest bonfire twisted, the flames slithering with her body. No one noticed. When I say so, he said. She knew he was using the people around them, her fear for their safety, to get her to master her control, but I'm sweating to death. I'm starving, and I want a break. Resorting to whining? A cool breeze licked up her neck as she closed her eyes, moaning. She could feel him watching her, and after a moment she said, just a little while longer. She almost sagged with relief, She almost sagged with relief, but opened her eyes to focus. She could hold out for a bit, then go eat and eat and eat. Maybe dance. She hadn't danced in so long. Maybe she would try it out, here in the shadows, see if her body could find room for joy, even though it was currently so hot and aching that she would bet good money that the moment she stopped she would fall asleep. But the music was entrancing. The dancers mere shadows swirling around. Unlike in Ardalan, There were no guards monitoring the festivities, no villagers lurking to see who might cross the line into treason and earn a pretty coin for whoever they turned in. There was just the music, and the dancing, and the food, and the fire. Her fire. She tapped a foot, bobbing her head, eyes on the 3 smokeless fires and the silhouettes dancing around them. She did want to dance. Not from joy, but because she felt her fire, and the music meld and pulse against her bones. The music was a tapestry, woven of light and dark and color, building delicate links in a chain that latched onto her heart and spread out into the world, binding her to it, connecting everything. She understood then. The word marks were a way of harnessing those threads, of weaving and binding the essence of things. Magic could do the same, and from her power, from her imagination and will and core, she could create the shape. She could create and shape, sorry. Easy, Rowan said, then added with a hint of surprise. Music. That day on the ice, you were humming. She registered another cool wind on her neck, but her skin was already pulsing in time with the drums. Let the music steady you. Gods to be free like this. The flames roiled and undulated with the melody. Easy. She could barely hear him above the wave of sound filling her up, making her feel each tether binding her to the earth, each infinite thread. For a breath, she wished for a shapeshifter's heart so she could shed her skin and weave herself into something else, the music or the wind or the blow across the world. Her eyes were stinging, almost blurry from staring so long at the flames, and a muscle in her back twinged. Steady. She didn't know what he was talking about. The flames were calm, lovely. What would happen if she walked through them? The pulsing in her head seemed to say it. To say, do it, do it, do it. That's enough for now. Rowan grabbed her arm, but hissed and let go. That is enough. Slowly, too slowly, she looked at him. His eyes were wide, the light of the fire making them almost blaze. Fire. Her fire. She returned to the flame, submitted to it. The music and the dancing continued, bright and merry. Look at me, Rowan said. It didn't touch her. Look at me. She could hardly hear him, as if she were underwater. There was a pounding in her now, edged with pain. It was a knife that sliced into her mind and her body with each pulse. She couldn't look at him, didn't dare take her attention from the fire. Let the fires burn on their own, Rowan ordered. She could have sworn she heard something like fear in his voice. It was an effort of will, and pain spiked down the tendons in her neck, but she looked at him. His nostrils flared. Aelin, stop right now. She tried to speak, but her throat was raw, burning. She couldn't move her body. Let go. She tried to tell him she couldn't, but it hurt. She was an anvil, and the pain was a hammer, striking again and again. If you don't let go, you're going to burn out completely. Was this the end of her magic, then? A few hours tending fires? Such a relief, such a blessed relief, if it were true. You're on the verge of roasting yourself from the inside out, Rowan snarled. She blinked, and her eyes ached as if she had sand in them. Agony lashed down her spine, so hard she fell to the grass. Light flared, not from her or Rowan, but from the fire surging. People yelled, the music faltered. The grass hissed beneath her hands, smoking. She groaned, fumbling inside for the 3 tethers to the fire. But she was a maze, a labyrinth, the strings all tangled and... I'm sorry, Rowan hissed, swearing again, and the air vanished. She tried to groan, to move. She had no air for that inner fire. Blackness swept in, oblivion. She was gasping, arcing off the grass, the fires now crackling naturally, and Rowan hovered over her. Breathe. Breathe. Though he'd snapped her tethers to the fires, she was still burning. Not burning on the outside, where even the grass had stopped smoldering. She was burning up from within. Each breath sent fire down her lungs, her veins. She could not speak or move. She had shoved herself over some boundary, hadn't heard the warning signs to turn back, and she was burning alive beneath her skin. She shook with tearless, panicked sobs. It hurt. It was endless and eternal, and there was no dark part of her where she could flee to escape the flames. Death would be a mercy, a cold black haven. She didn't know Rowan had left until he came sprinting back, 2 females in tow. One of them said, "Can you stand to carry her? There aren't any water wielders here, and we need to get her into cold water, now." She didn't hear what else was said, heard nothing but the pounding of that forge under her skin. There was a grunt and a hiss, and then she was in Rowan's arms, bouncing against his chest as he hurtled through the woods. Each step sent splinters of red-hot pain through her. Though her arms were ice-cold, a frigid wind pressed on her. She was adrift in a sea of fire. Hell, this was what the dark god's underworld felt like. This was what awaited her when she took her last breath. It was the horror of that thought that made her focus on what she could grasp, namely the pine and snow smell of ruin. She pulled that smell into her lungs, pulled it down deep, and clung to it as though it were a lifeline tossed into a stormy sea. She didn't know how long it took, but her grasp on him was weakening, each pulse of fiery pain fraying it. But then it was darker than the woods, and the sounds echoed louder, and they took stairs, and then get her into the water. She was lowered into the water in the sunken stone tub, then steam brushed her face. Someone swore. "Freeze it, Prince," the second voice commanded. "Now." There was a moment of blissful cold, but then the fire surged and, "Get her out now." Strong hands yanked at her, and she had the vague sense of hearing bubbling. Jesus, how hot is she? She had boiled the water in that tub, almost boiled herself. She was in another tub a moment later, the ice forming again, then melting, and, "Breathe," Rowan said by her ear, kneeling at the head of the tub. "Let it go. Let it get out of you." Steam rose, but she took a breath. "Good," Rowan panted. Ice formed again, melted. She was sweating, heat pulsing against her skin like a drum. She did not want to die like this. She took another breath. Like the ebb and flow of the tide, the bath froze, then melted, froze, then melted, slower each time, and each time the cold soaked into her a bit more, numbing her, urging her body to relax. Ice and fire, frost and embers, locked in a battle, pushing and pulling. Beneath it she could almost taste Rowan's steel with slamming against her magic. A will that refused to let the fire burn her into nothing. Her body ached, but now the pain was mortal. Her cheeks were still aflame, but the water went cold, then lukewarm, then warm, and stayed that way. Warm, not hot. "We need to get those clothes off of her," one of the females said. Selena lost track of time as two small sets of hands eased up her head and then stripped off her sodden clothes. Without them, she was almost weightless in the water. She didn't care if Rowan saw. Didn't think there was an inch of a woman's body he hadn't already explored anyway. She lay there, eyes shut, face tilted toward the ceiling. After a while, Rowan said, "Just answer yes or no. That's all you have to do." She managed a slight nod, though she winced as pain shot down her neck and shoulders. "Are you in danger of flaring up again?" She was breathing as evenly as she could, the heat pounding in her cheeks, her legs, her core, but it was steadily diminishing. "No," she whispered, a brush of hot air from her tongue. "Are you in pain?" Not a sympathetic question, but a commander assessing his soldier's condition to sort out the best course of action. "Yes," a hiss of steam. A woman said, "We'll prepare a tonic. Just keep her cool." Soft feet padded on the stone floors on their way out. Then came the snick of the door and the bath's closing. There was a slosh of water in a bucket, then Selena sighed, or tried to, as an ice-cold cloth was laid on her forehead. More sloshing, then another cloth dripped freezing water onto her hair, her neck. "The burnout," Rowan said quietly. "You should have told me you were at your limit." Speaking was too hard, but she opened her eyes to find him kneeling at the head of the bath, a bucket of water beside him and a cloth in his hands. He wrung it again, over her brow. The water so wonderful she would have moaned. The bath cooled further. It was still warm. But it was still warm. Too warm. If you'd gone any longer, the burnout would have destroyed you. You must learn to recognize the signs and how to pull back before it's too late. Not a statement, but a command. It'll rip you apart inside. Make this, he shook his head again, make this look like nothing. You don't touch your magic unless you've rested for a while, understand? She tilted her head up, beckoning for more cold water on her face, but he refused to wring the cloth until she nodded her agreement. He cooled her off for another few moments, then slung the cloth over the side of the bucket and stood. Thought my phone was dying, sorry. I'm going to check on the tonic. I'll be back soon. He left once she nodded again. If she hadn't known better, she might have thought he was fussing, worried even. She hadn't been old enough in Terrasen to have anyone teach her about the deadly side of her power, and no one had explained, since her lessons had been so limited. She hadn't felt like she was burning out. It had come on so quickly. Maybe that was all there was to her magic. Maybe her well didn't go as deep as everyone thought. As deep as everyone had thought, sorry. It would be a relief if that were true. She lifted her legs, groaning at the aches along her muscles, and leaned forward far enough to hug her knees. Above the lip of the sunken tub, there were a few candles burning on the stones, and she glared at the flames. Hated the flames, though she supposed they needed light in here. She rested her forehead on her scarred knees, her skin nearly scorching. She shut her eyes, piecing her splintered consciousness together. The door opened. Rowan. She kept herself in that cool darkness, savoring the growing chill in the water, the quieting pulse under her skin. He sounded about halfway across the room when his footsteps halted. His breath caught, harshly enough that she looked over her shoulder. But his eyes weren't on her face or the water. They were on her bare back. Oh, he saw them. He finally saw them, y'all. Curled as she was against her knees, he could see the whole expanse of ruined flesh, each scar from the lashings. Oh no. Not my favorite trope. Oh my god. Not the who did this to you. Who did that to you? It would have been easy to lie, but she was so tired. And he had saved her useless hide, so she said, "A lot of people. I spent some times in the salt mines of Endivere." He was so still that she wondered if he'd stop breathing. "How long?" he asked after a moment. She braced herself for the pity, but his face was so carefully blank. No, not blank. Calm, with lethal rage. A year. I was there a year before. It's a long story. She was too exhausted, her throat too raw to say the rest of it. She noticed then that his arms were bandaged, and more bandages across his broad chest peeked up from beneath his shirt. She burned him again, and yet he had held on to her, and had run all the way here and not let go once. "You were a slave." She gave him a slow nod. He opened his mouth but shut it and swallowed, that lethal rage winking out. As if he remembered who he was talking to, and that it was the least punishment she deserved. He turned on his heel and shut the door behind him. She wished he'd slammed it, wished he'd shattered it, but he closed it with barely more than a click and did not return. What? I don't understand. I don't understand what just happened. Chapter 42. Her back. Oh! Rowan soared over the trees, riding and shaping the winds to push him onward faster, their roar negligible to the bellowing in his head. He took in the passing world out of instinct rather than interest, his eyes turned inward, toward that slab of ruined flesh glistening in the candlelight. The gods knew he'd seen plenty of harrowing injuries. He'd bestowed plenty of them on his enemies and friends alike. In the grand sense of things, her back wasn't even close to some of those wounds. Yet when he'd seen it, his heart had clean stopped, and for a moment there had been an overwhelming silence in his mind. He felt his magic and his warrior's instincts honing into a lethal combination the longer he stared, howling to rip apart the people who had done that with his bare hands. Then he just left, hardly making it out of the baths before he shifted and soared into the night. Maeve had lied, or lied by omission, but she knew. She knew what the girl had gone through, knew she'd been a slave. That day early on, he'd threatened to whip the girl, God's above, and she'd lost it. He'd been such a proud fool that he'd assumed she'd lashed out because she was nothing more than a child. He should have known better. Should have known that when she did react to something like that, it meant the scars went deep. And then there were the other things he'd said. He was almost to the towering line of the Cambrian mountains. She had barely been grown into her own woman's body when they hurt her like that. Why hadn't she told him? Why hadn't Maeve told him? His hawk loosed a piercing cry that echoed on the dark gray stones of the mountain wall before him. A chorus of unearthly howls rose in response. Maeve's wild wolves, guarding the passes. Even if he flew all the way to Dornell, he'd reach his queen and demand answers, and she would not give them to him. With the blood oath, she could command he not go back to Mistward. He gripped the winds with his magic, choking off their current. Aelin had not trusted him, had not wanted him to know. And she'd almost burned out completely, gods be damned, leaving her currently defenseless. Primal anger sharpened in his gut, brimming with a territorial, possessive need. Not a need for her, but a need to protect. A male's duty and honor. He had not handled the news as he should have. If she hadn't wanted to tell him about being a slave, then she probably had done so assuming the worst about him, just as she was probably assuming the worst about his leaving. The thought didn't sit well. So he veered back to the north and rained his magic to pull the winds with him, easing his flight back to the fortress. He would get answers from his queen soon enough. Damn. The healers gave her a tonic, and when Selena reassured them that she wasn't going to incinerate herself, she stayed in the bath until her teeth were chattering. It took 3 times as long as usual to get back to her rooms, and she was so frozen and drained that she didn't change into clothes before she dropped into bed. She didn't want to think about what it meant that Rowan had left like that, but she did, aching and cramping from the magic. She drifted into a jerking, fitful sleep, a cold so fierce she couldn't tell whether it was from the temperature or the aftermath of the magic. At some point, she was awoken by the laughing and singing of the returning revelers. After a while, even the drunkest found their bed, or someone else's. She was almost asleep again, teeth still chattering when her window groaned open in the breeze. She was too cold and sore to get up. There was a flutter of wings and a flash of light, and before she could roll over, he'd scooped her up, blanket and all. If she'd had energy, she might have objected, but he carried her up the 2 flights of stairs, down the hall, and then a roaring fire, warm sheets and a soft mattress, and a heavy quilt that was tucked in with surprising gentleness. The fire dimmed on a phantom wind, and then the mattress shifted. In the flickering dark, he said roughly, "You're staying with me from now on." She found him lying as far away from her as he could without falling off the mattress. "The bed is for tonight. Tomorrow you'll get a cot. You'll clean up after yourself, or you'll be back in that room." She nestled into her pillow. "Very well." The fire dimmed, yet the room remained toasty. It was the first warm bed she'd had in months. But she said, "I don't want your pity. This is not pity. Maeve decided not to tell me what happened to you. You have to know that I wasn't aware you had..." She slid an arm across the bed to grasp his hand. She knew that if she wanted to, she could strike him a wound so deep it would fracture him. "I knew, at first. At first I was afraid you'd mock me if I told you, and I would kill you for it. Then I didn't want you to pity me, and more than any of that, I didn't want you to think it was ever an excuse." "Like a good soldier," he said. She had to look away for a moment to keep from letting him see just what that meant to her. He took a long breath that made his broad chest expand. "Tell me how you were sent there, and how you got out." We don't need to go through that again. We don't. She was tired in her bones, but she still rallied her energy one last time and told him of the years in Rifthold, of stealing Assyrian horses and racing across the desert, of dancing until dawn with courtesans and thieves and all the beautiful, wicked creatures in the world. And then she told him about losing Sam, and of that first whipping in Endeavere, when she'd spat blood in the chief overseer's face, and what she had seen and endured the following year. She spoke of the day she had snapped and sprinted for her own death. Her heart grew heavy when at last she got to the evening when the captain of the Royal Guard prowled into her life, and a tyrant's son had offered her a shot at freedom. She told him what she could about the competition and how she'd won it, until her words slurred and her eyelids drooped. There would be more time to tell him of what happened next, of the word keys, and Elena and Nehemiah, and how she had become so broken and useless. She yawned, and Rowan rubbed his eyes, his other hand still in hers, but he didn't let go. And when she awoke before dawn, warm and safe and rested, Rowan was still holding her hand, clasped to his chest. Something molten rushed through her, pouring over every crack and fracture still left gaping and open, not to hurt or mar, but to weld, to forge. Damn. The burp. Chapter 43. Rowan didn't let her get out of bed that day. He brought trays of food, going so far as to make sure she consumed every last drop of beef stew, half a loaf of crusty bread, a bowl of the first spring berries, and a mug of ginger tea. He hardly needed to offer any encouragement to eat. She was starving. But if she didn't know better, she'd say he was fussing. Emrys and Luca visited once to see if she was alive, took one look at Rowan's stone-cold face, heard the ripple of a growl, and took off, saying she was in more than competent hands and promising to come back when she was feeling better. You know, Selena said, propping in bed with her 4th mug of tea of the day, I highly doubt anyone is going to attack me now if they've already put up with my nonsense for this long. Rowan, who was yet again poring over the map of the location of the bodies, didn't even look up from his seat at his work table. This isn't negotiable. She might have laughed had her body not given a burst of twisting, blinding pain. She bore down on it, clenching her mug, focusing on her breathing. That was why she'd allowed him to fuss. Thanks to her magical meltdown last night, every damn part of her was sore. The constant throb and stinging and twisting, the headache between her brows, the fuzziness on the edge of her vision, even sliding her gaze across the room sent sparks of pain through her head. So you mean to tell me that whenever someone comes close to burnout, she not only goes through all this misery, but if she's female, the males around her go berserk? He set down his pen and twisted to examine her. This is hardly berserk. At least you can defend yourself by physical means when your magic is useless. For other Fae, even if they've had weapons and defense training, if they can't touch their magic, they're vulnerable, especially when they're drained and in pain. That makes people, usually males, yes, somewhat edgy. Others have been known to kill without thought any perceived threat, real or otherwise. What sort of threat? Maeve's lands are peaceful. She leaned over to set down her tea, but he was already moving, so swift that he intercepted her mug before it could hit the table. He took it from her with surprising gentleness, saw that she drained it, and poured another cup. Threats from anywhere. Males, females, creatures. You can't reason against it. Even if it wasn't in her culture, there would still be an instinct to protect the defenseless, regardless of whether they're female or male, young or old. He reached for a slice of bread and a bowl of beef broth. Eat this. It pains me to say this, but one more bite and I'll be sick all over the place. Oh, he was definitely fussing, and though it warmed her miserable heart, it was becoming rather irritating. The bastard just dipped the bread into the broth and held them out to her. You need to keep up your energy. You probably came so close to burnout because you didn't have enough food in your stomach. Fine. It smelled good. It smelled too good to resist anyway. She took the bread and the broth. While she ate, he made sure the room passed inspection. The fire was still high, suffocatingly hot, as it had been since morning, thanks to the chills that had racked her. Ow! Only one window was cracked to allow in the slightest of breezes when she had hot flashes. The door was shut and locked, and yet another pot of tea was waiting, currently steeping on his work table. When he was done ensuring all was accounted for and no threats lurked in the shadows, he looked her over with the same scrutiny, skin wan and gleaming from the remnants of those hot flashes, lips pale and cracked, posture limp and useless, eyes pain-dimmed and increasingly full of irritation. Rowan frowned again. After handing the empty bowl to him, she rubbed her thumb and forefinger against the persistent headache between her brows. So when the magic runs out, she said, that's it. Either you stop or you burn out. Rowan leaned back in his chair. Well, there's the what? The Karanam? The Karanam? There's the Karanam? I feel like I sound like a hick when I say that. The old language word was beautiful on his tongue, and if she'd had a death wish, she might have begged him to speak only in the ancient language, just to savor the exquisite sounds. It's hard to explain, Rowan went on. I've only ever seen it used a handful of times on killing fields. When you're drained, your Karanam? Whatever. Can yield their power to you, as long as you're compatible in actively sharing a blood connection. She tilted her head to the side. If we were Karanam, and I gave you my power, would you still only be using wind and ice, not my fire? He nodded gravely. Oh, because they share blood, because they're related. Another fucking reminder. He nodded gravely. How do you know if you're compatible with someone? There's no way of telling until you try, and the bond is so rare that the majority of Fae never meet someone who's compatible, or whom they trust enough to test it out. There's always a threat that they could take too much, And if they're unskilled, they could shatter your mind. Or you could both burn out completely. Karanam. I think yeah, I'll just, okay. Interesting. Could you ever just steal magic from someone? Less savory Fae once attempted to do so, to win battles and add to their own power, but it never worked. And if it did, it was because the person they held hostage was coincidentally compatible. Maeve outlawed any forced bonds long before I was born, but I've been sent a few times to hunt down corrupt Fae who keep their Karanam as slaves. Usually the slaves are so broken there's no way to rehabilitate them. Putting them down is the only mercy I can offer. His face and voice didn't change, but she said softly, "Doing that must be harder than all the wars and sieges you've ever waged." A shadow darted across his harsh face. Immortality is not as much of a gift as mortals would believe. It can breed monsters that even you would be sick to learn about. Imagine the sadists you've encountered, and then imagine them with millennia to hone their craft and warped desires. Selena shuddered. "This conversation's become too awful to have after eating," she said, slumping against the pillows. "Tell me which one of your little cat..." Yo, do I not know how to read? Do I not know how to read? I don't know what that word says. And I lost my spot. Ow. And if he would fancy me. Rowan choked. The thought of you with any of my companions makes my blood run cold. They're that awful? Your kitty cat friend looked decent enough. Rowan's brows rose high. I don't think my kitty cat friend would know what to do with you, nor would any of the others. It would likely end in bloodshed. She kept grinning, and he crossed his arms. They would likely have very little interest in you, and you'll be old and decrepit soon enough, and thus not worth the effort it would take to win you? Damn! She rolled her eyes. Killjoy. Silence fell, and he looked her over again, lucid, if drained and moody, and she wasn't surprised when he glanced at her bare wrists, one of the few bits of skin showing thanks to all the blankets he'd piled on top of her. They hadn't discussed it last night, but she knew he'd been working up to it. There was no judgment in his eyes as he said, "A skilled healer could probably get rid of those scars. Definitely the ones on your wrist, and most on your back." She clenched her jaw, but after a moment loosed a long breath. Even though she knew he would understand without much explanation, she said, "There were cells in the bowels of the mines that they used to punish slaves. Cells so dark you would wake up in them and think you'd been blinded. They locked me in there sometimes, once for 3 weeks straight, and the only thing that got me through it was reminding myself of my name, over and over and over. I am Selena Sardathian." Rowan's face was drawn, but she went on. "When they would let me out, so much of my mind had shut down in the darkness that the only thing I could remember was that my name was Selena. Selena Sardathian, arrogant and brave and skilled. Selena, who did not know fear or despair. Selena, who was a weapon honed by death." She ran a shaking hand through her hair. "I don't usually let myself think about that part of Endivir," she admitted. "After I got out, there were nights when I would wake up and think I was back in those cells, and I would have to light every candle in my room to prove I wasn't. They don't just kill you in the mines, they break you. There are thousands of slaves in Endivir, and a good number are from Terrasen. Regardless of what I do with my birthright, I'm going to find a way to free them someday. I will free them. Them, and all the slaves in Calicula too. So my scars serve as a reminder of that." She never said it, but there it was. Once she dealt with the king of Ardalan, if destroying him somehow didn't put an end to the labor camp, she would, stone by stone if necessary. Rowan asked, "What happened 10 years ago, Aelin?" "I'm not going to talk about that. If you took up your crown, you could free Endivir far more easily than... I can't talk about it." "Why?" There was a pit in the memory. A pit she couldn't climb out of if she ever fell in. It wasn't her parents' deaths. She had been able to tell others in vague terms about their murders. That pain was still staggering, still haunted her, but waking up between their corpses wasn't the moment that had shattered everything Aelin Galathinius was and might have been. In the back of her mind, she heard another woman's voice, lovely and frantic. Another woman who... She rubbed her brows again. There's this rage, she said hoarsely. This despair and hatred and rage that lives and breathes inside me. There's no sanity to it, no gentleness. It's a monster dwelling under my skin. For the past 10 years, I've worked every day, every hour, to keep that monster locked up. And the moment I talk about those 2 days and what happened before and after, that monster is going to break loose, and there will be no accounting for what I do. That is how I was able to stand before the King of Ardalan, how I was able to befriend his son and his captain, how I was able to live in that palace, because I did not give that rage, those memories, 1 inch. And right now, I'm looking for the tools that might destroy my enemy, and I cannot let out that monster, because it will make me use those tools against the king, not push them back as I should, and I might very well destroy the world for spite. So that is why I must be Selena, not Aelin, because being Aelin means facing those things and unleashing that monster. Do you understand? For whatever it's worth, I don't think he would destroy the world from spite. His voice turned hard. But I also think you like to suffer. You collect scars because you want proof that you're paying for whatever sins you've committed. And I know this because I've been doing the same damn thing for 200 years. Tell me, do you think you will go to some blessed afterworld, or do you expect a burning hell? You're hoping for hell, because how could you face them in the afterworld? Better to suffer, to be damned for eternity, and that's enough, she whispered. She must have sounded as miserable and small as she felt because he turned back to the work table. She shut her eyes, but her heart was thundering. She didn't know how much time passed. After a while, the mattress shifted and groaned, and a warm body pressed against hers, not holding her, just lying beside her. She didn't open her eyes, but she breathed in the smell of him, the pine and snow, and her pain settled a bit. At least if you're going to hell, he said, the vibrations in his chest rumbling against her. Then we'll be there together. I feel bad for the dark god already. He brushed a large hand down her hair, and she almost purred. She hadn't realized just how much she missed being touched by anyone, friend or lover. When I'm back to normal, can I assume you're going to yell at me about almost burning out? He let out a soft laugh, but continued stroking her hair. You've no idea. She smiled against the pillow, and his hand stilled for a moment, then started again. After a long while, he murmured, I have no doubt that you'll be able to free the slaves from the labor camps someday, no matter what name you use. Her eyes burned behind their lids, but she leaned into his touch some more, even going so far as to put a hand on his broad chest, savoring the steady, assured heartbeat pounding beneath. Thank you for looking after me, she said. He grunted, acceptance or dismissal she didn't know. Sleep tugged at her, and she followed it into oblivion. I fucking guess. Ow! Fuck. God damn. Did y'all hear that? Jeez. What damn shoulder popped. Rowan kept her cooped up in his room for a few more days. Hi, Nico. I didn't even see that you were here. Hi, Nico. It's going good. Y'all, we knew that I was gonna end up liking Rowan, or like accepting him at the very least. I mean, I hated him in the beginning because he was a bitch to her. A bitch in general. He's alright now. I wouldn't say that he is my top choice, but he is alright. I'm tolerating him. That's how I'll put it. I'm tolerating him now. We'll see if I get any further up than that. Rowan kept her cooped up in his room for a few more days, and even once she told him she was feeling fine, he made her spend an extra half day in bed. She supposed it was nice, having someone, even an overbearing, snarling Fey warrior, bothering to care whether she lived or died. Her birthday arrived. 19 somehow felt rather dull. She's only 19. I forget that this girl is literally a child. Like, she's literally a child. Not literally a child, but like, to me, she's just a baby, and she's been through so much. And her sole present was that Rowan left her alone for a few hours. He came back with the news of another demi-fake corpse found near the coast. She asked him to let her see it, but he flat out refused. Barked at her was more like it, and said he'd already gone to see it himself. It was the same pattern. A dried nosebleed, a body drained until only a husk remained, and then a careless dumping. He'd also gone back to that town, where they had been more than happy to see him, since he'd brought gold and silver. I saw you crying on Insta. Yes, it was because of the Stranger Things finale. Don't worry, I won't say any spoilers, but let me just say that the acting, phenomenal. Yeah, girl. It was very good, very sad. Very good, very sad. And he'd returned to Selena with chocolates, since he claimed to be insulted that she considered his absence a proper birthday present. She tried to embrace him, but he would have none of that, and told her as much. Still, the next time she used the bathing room, she'd snuck behind his chair at the work table and planted a great smacking kiss on his cheek. He'd waved her off and wiped his face with a snarl, but she had the suspicion that he'd let her get past his defenses. It was a mistake to think that finally going back outdoors would be delightful. Selena was standing across a mossy clearing from Rowan, her knees slightly bent, hands in loose fists. Rowan hadn't told her to, but she'd gotten into a defensive position upon seeing the faint gleam in his eyes. Rowan only looked like this when he was about to make her life a living hell. And since they hadn't gone to the temple ruins, she assumed he thought she'd at least mastered one element of her power, despite the events of Beltane, which meant they were on to mastering the next. Your magic lacks shape, Rowan said at last, standing so still that she envied him for it. And because it has no shape, you have little control. As a form of attack, a fireball or wave of flame is useful, yes, but if you're engaging in a skilled combatant, if you want to be able to use your power, then you have to learn to fight with it. She groaned. But, he added sharply, you have one advantage that many magic wielders do not. You already know how to fight with weapons. First chocolates on my birthday, now an actual compliment? His eyes narrowed, and they had yet another of their wordless conversations. The more you talk, the more I'm going to make you pay in a moment. She smiled slightly. Apologies, Master. I'm yours to instruct. Vrad. He jerked his chin at her. Your fire can take whatever form you wish, and the only limit being your imagination. And considering your upbringing, you should go on the offensive. You want me to make a sword out of fire? Arrows, daggers. You direct the power. Visualize it, and use it as you would a mortal weapon. She swallowed. He smirked. Afraid to play with fire, princess? You won't be happy if I singe your eyebrows off. Try me. When you trained as an assassin, what was the first thing you learned? How to defend myself. She understood why he'd looked so amused for the past few minutes when he said, Good. Not surprisingly, having ice daggers thrown at her was miserable. Rowan hurled dagger after magical dagger at her, and every damn time the shield of fire that she tried and failed to imagine did nothing. If it appeared at all, it was always manifested too far to the left or right. Rowan didn't want a wall of flame. No, he wanted a small, controlled shield, and it didn't matter how many times he nicked her hands or arms or face. It didn't matter that dried blood was now itching down her cheeks. One shield. That was all she had to craft, and he would stop. Sweating and panting, Selena was beginning to wonder if she should step directly into the path of his next dagger and put herself out of her suffering when Rowan growled, Try harder. I am trying, she snapped, rolling aside as he sent two gleaming ice daggers at her head. Sorry, I had a thought and I got carried away with it. You're acting like you're on the verge of a burnout. Maybe I am. If you believe for one moment that you're close to a burnout after an hour of practicing. It happened that quickly on Beltane. That was not the end of your power. His next ice dagger hovered in the air beside his head. You fell into the lure of the magic and let it do what it wanted. Let it consume you. Had you kept your head, you could have had those fires burning for weeks, months. No, she didn't have any better answer than that. His nostrils flared slightly. I knew it. You wanted your powers to be insignificant. You were relieved when you thought that was all you had. Without warning, he sent the dagger, then the next at her. She raised her left arm as she would raise a shield, picturing the flame surrounding her arm, blocking those daggers, obliterating them, but she cursed so loudly that the birds stopped their chatter. She clutched her forearm as blood welled and soaked in her tunic. Stop hitting me! I get the point! But another dagger came, and another. Ducking and dodging, raising her bloodied arm again and again, she gritted her teeth and swore at him. He sent a dagger twirling with dead efficiency, and she couldn't move fast enough to avoid the thin scratch along her cheekbone. She hissed. He was right. He was always right, and she hated that, almost as much as she hated the power that flooded her and did what it wanted. It was hers to command, not the other way around. She was not its slave. She was no one's slave anymore. And if Rowan threw one more damned dagger at her face, he did. The ice crystal didn't make it past her upraised forearm before it vanished into a hiss of steam. Selena gazed over the flickering edge of the compact, red, burning flame before her arm, shaped like a shield. Rowan smiled slowly. We're done for today. Go eat something. The circular shield did not burn her, though its flame swirled and sizzled as she commanded. It had worked. So she raised her eyes to Rowan. No. Again. After a week of making shields of various sizes and temperatures, Selena could have multiple defenses burning at once, and encircled the entire glen with half a thought to protect it from outside assault. And when she awoke one morning before dawn, she couldn't say why she did it, but she slipped from the room she shared with Rowan and went down to the ward stones. She shivered from more than the early morning cold as the power of the curving gate stones zinged against her skin when she passed through. But none of the sentries on the battlements ordered her to stop as she walked along the line of towering, carved rocks until she found a bit of even ground and began to practice. Damn. Not her getting good. Ow, fuck! Just popped my freaking foot. Are we reading 44 today? Because I think it's, as the 13. Oh, we're back to Manon. It's only 3 pages. I mean, we can read it. Y'all, never mind. We'll talk about this after the live. I'm gonna read 44. Chapter 44. As one of the 13 led the other Blackbeak covens in the skies, drill after drill, through rain and sun and wind, until they were all tanned and freckled. Even though Abraxas had yet to make the crossing, the spider silk patching on his wings improved his flying significantly. It was all going beautifully. Abraxas had gotten into a brawl for dominance with Lynn's bull and emerged victorious, and after that, none in her coven or any other challenged him. The war games were fast approaching, and though Iskra hadn't been any trouble since the night Manon had half killed her, they watched their backs, in the baths, around every dark corner, double-checking every rein and strap before they mounted their wyverns. Yes, it was all going beautifully, until Manon was summoned to her grandmother's room. "Why is it," her grandmother said by way of greeting, pacing the room, teeth always out, "that I have to hear from God's damned Cressida that your runty, useless wyvern hasn't made the crossing? Why is it that I'm in the middle of a meeting, planning these war games so you can win, and the other matrons tell me that you aren't allowed to participate because your mount will not make the crossing and therefore isn't allowed to fly in the host?" Manon glimpsed the flash of nails before they raked down her cheek, not hard enough to scar, but enough to bleed. "You and that beast are an embarrassment," her grandmother hissed, teeth snapping in her face. "All I want is for you to win these games, so we can take our rightful place as queens, not high witches. Queens of the Waste, Manon, and you were doing your best to ruin it." Manon kept her eyes on the ground, Her grandmother dug a nail into her chest, cutting through her red cloak, piercing the flesh right above her heart. Has your heart melted? No. No, her grandmother sneered. No, it cannot melt, because you do not have a heart, Manon. We are not born with them, and we are glad of it. She pointed to the stone floor. Why is it that I am informed today that Iskra caught a God's-damned Crochan spying on us? Why am I the last to know that she is in our dungeons and that they have been interrogating her for 2 days? Manon blinked, but that was all the surprise she let show. If Crochans were spying on them, another slice to the face, marring the other cheek. You will make the crossing tomorrow, Manon. Tomorrow, and I don't care if you splatter yourself on the rocks. If you live, you had better pray to the darkness that you win those games, because if you don't... Her grandmother sliced a nail across Manon's throat, a scratch to set the blood running, and a promise. Everyone came this time to watch the crossing. Abraxas was saddled, focus pinned on the cave mouth open to the night beyond. Asterin and Sorel were behind her, but beside them, their mounts, not astride them. Her grandmother had got wind of how they planned to save her and forbidden it. It was Manon's own stupidity and pride that had to pay, she'd said. Witches lined the viewing platform, and from high above, the high witches and their heirs watched from a small balcony. The noise was near deafening. Manon glanced at Asterin and Sorel and found them looking stone-cold fierce, but tense. Keep to the wall so he doesn't spook your wyverns, she told them. They nodded grimly. Since grafting the spider silk onto Abraxas's wings, Manon had been careful not to push him too hard until the healing was absolutely complete. But the crossing, with its plunge and winds, his wings could be shredded in a matter of seconds if the silk didn't hold. We're waiting, Manon, her grandmother barked from above. She waved a hand toward the cave mouth. But by all means, take your time. Laughter from the yellow legs, Blackbeaks, everyone. Yet Petra wasn't smiling, and none of the 13, gathered closest along the viewing platform, were smiling either. Manon turned to Abraxas, looking into those eyes. Let's go. She tugged on his reins, but he refused to move, not from fear or terror. He slowly lifted his head, looking to where her grandmother stood, and let out a low, warning growl. A threat. Manon knew she should reprimand him for the disrespect, but the fact that he could grasp what was occurring in this hall, it should have been impossible. The night is waning, her grandmother called, heedless of the beast that stared at her with such rage in his eyes. Sorel and Asterin exchanged glances, and she could have sworn her second's hand twitched toward the hilt of her sword. Not to hurt Abraxas, but every single one of the 13 was casually reaching for their weapons, to fight their way out in case her grandmother gave the order to have Manon and Abraxas put down. They'd heard the challenge in Abraxas's growl, understood that the beast had drawn a line in the sand. They were not born with hearts, her grandmother had said. They had all been told that. Obedience, discipline, brutality, those were the things they were supposed to cherish. Asterin's eyes were bright, stunningly bright, and she nodded once at Manon. It was that same feeling she'd gotten when Iskra whipped Abraxas, that thing she couldn't describe, but it blinded her. Manon gripped Abraxas's snout, forcing his gaze away from her grandmother. Just once, she whispered. All you have to do is make that jump just once, Abraxas, and then you can shut them up forever. Then, rising up from the deep, there came a steady 2-note beat, the beat of the chained bait beasts who hauled the massive machines around like a thudding heart or beating wings. Louder the beat sounded, as if the wyverns down in the pits knew what was happening. It grew and grew until it reached the cavern, until Asterin reached for her shield and joined in, until each one of the 13 took up the beat. You hear that? That is for you. For a moment, as the beast pulsed around them, phantom wings from the mountain itself, Manon thought it would not be so bad to die, if it was with him, if she was not alone. You are one of the 13, she said to him. From now until the darkness cleaves us apart, you are mine, and I am yours. Let's show them why. He huffed into her palms as if to say he already knew all that, and that she was just wasting time. She smiled faintly, even as Abraxas cast another challenging glare in her grandmother's direction. The wyvern lowered himself to the ground for Manon to climb into the saddle. The distance to the entrance seemed so much shorter in the saddle than on foot. She did not let herself doubt him as she blinked her inner lid into place and retracted her teeth. The spider silk would hold. She would consider no alternative. "Fly, Abraxas," she told him, and dug her spurs into his sides. Like a roaring star, he thundered down the long chute, and Manon moved with him, meeting each gallop of his powerful body, each step in time with the beat of the wyverns locked in the belly of the mountain. Abraxas flapped his wings open, pounding them once, twice, gathering speed, fearless, unrelenting, ready. Still the beat did not stop, not from the wyverns, or from the 13, or from the black-beaked covens who picked it up, stomping their feet or clapping their hands. Not from the blue-blood heir who clapped her sword against her dagger, or the blue-blood witches who followed her lead. The entire mountain shook with the sound. Faster and faster Abraxas raced for the drop, and Manon held on tight. The cave mouth opened wide. Abraxas tucked in his wings, using the movement to give his body one last shove over the lip as he took Manon with him and plunged. Fast as lightning, arcing across the sky, he plummeted toward the gap floor. Manon rose up into the saddle, clinging as her braid ripped free from her cloak, then came loose from its bonds, pulling painfully behind her, making her eyes water despite the lids. Down and down he fell, wings tucked in tight, tail straight and balanced. Down into hell, into eternity, into that world where, for a moment, she could have sworn that something tightened in her chest. She did not shut her eyes, not as the moon illuminated stones of the gap became closer, clearer. She did not need to. Like the sails of a mighty ship, Abraxas's wings unfurled, snapping tight. He tilted them upward, pulling against the death, trying to drag them down. And it was those wings, covered in glimmering patches of spider silk, that stayed strong and sturdy, sending them soaring clean up the side of the Omega and into the starry sky beyond. Aww! Abraxas! Yay! We all know he was gonna do it. We all know he was gonna make it. My baby Abraxas. We all knew he was gonna make it. Y'all, we're almost done with it. Holy shit. This book looks like it's been through hell. All my books look like they've been through hell. Okay, final thoughts for today's reading. We love Selena. That's been decided. Rowan is now something that I will tolerate. Rowan and Selena is now something that I will tolerate. I'll just pack my bags and move my mind to Alabama so that I can be even more comfortable with it. What else? I'm mad that we didn't get any Dorian content this reading. I miss him. Even though I just got some Dorian content in chapter 40, but I miss him. I'm mad at Kale. Abraxas is my child, and I love him. Manon has a heart, it's confirmed. And so do all the other witches. Yeah, I think that's it. This reading was short today. It's only been an hour since I went live. Anyway, now on to more important things that I've been wanting to talk to y'all about. Actually, okay. So I finished Obi-Wan Friday night. I finished Obi-Wan, right? I don't know if you guys have seen it, but I'm not gonna say any spoilers. But first of all, it was really good. They did such a good job with that show and tying it into the rest of the Star Wars franchise, movies, whatever. Loved it. 10 out of 10, I loved it. But anyway, ever since then, I have been in this Anakin brain rot, y'all. Anakin, and look, Revenge of the Sith came out in 2005. I was 7 years old when it came out, right? I watched that movie religiously. I watched that movie so much, my mom told me that I was not allowed to watch it anymore because she was sick of me watching that movie. I loved that movie. That was the first Star Wars movie I ever watched. Actually, no, it wasn't. No, yeah, it was. That was the first Star Wars movie I ever watched. I didn't know what Star Wars was when I was 7, okay? I knew what it was, but I didn't know where to start. That was the first Star Wars movie I watched. And then I went back and I watched all the other ones. Anyway, I have been nonstop thinking about Anakin since I started watching the show, honestly. But, now that it's over, I still have to watch Obi-Wan. Okay, I won't say any spoilers then. But, I can't stop thinking about Anakin. And it was so good. It was so good. The last episode was so good. I cried like a baby. I cried every single episode of the show because I love Anakin so much. And it's just, yeah. It was really good. I know exactly what you're talking about, Nico. I know exactly what you're talking about. Yep. That, yeah. And I cried even harder because I was like, never mind. But I was crying, y'all. Crying. And then I watched Stranger Things that night and I cried even harder. These shows just fuck me up, y'all. These shows and these books, they fuck me up. Yeah. But anyway, like literally before I got on live, I was just watching, I just look up Anakin Skywalker on TikTok and I go through all the videos. The sad ones and the thirst trap ones, I go through them all. I went through them all. Did you like the Stranger Things finale? I liked it, but I also didn't like it. I think, actually, I don't know. Has everyone seen Stranger Things? Because this isn't a spoiler, but just having everyone all over the world, like in different places, it got annoying very fast. But I did like it. Like, I loved the show. I don't think that they can really do any wrong. The Duffer Brothers have showed that they care about their show so much. But I will say that some things just didn't make sense to me. I felt incomplete. I liked it, but it felt like, I don't know, and I can't put my finger on it, but it felt like that wasn't what it was hyped up to be, because they said it was going to be carnage and that we were getting 5 deaths and that it was, going to be this big spectacle, sort of like their Infinity War where they lose. And it was just, I feel like it didn't live up to their hype, which is all right. I mean, it was still really good and I still really enjoyed it, but I thought it was going to be, and it was still really painful, even though, like, not a lot of, like, I don't want to say any spoilers because I don't know who all has finished this. If you haven't finished Stranger Things, just mute it. Just mute this. Because I cried, but I cried like a baby. I still cried like a baby. I love your page. My BF is a book fanatic. What do you recommend as a gift? A book fanatic? Definitely some bookmarks, because if they're like me and they don't, if they use random things as bookmarks, we definitely need bookmarks. If they haven't read Throne of Glass, get them Throne of Glass. I don't know. I felt like Volume 2 was a part of Volume 1. Yeah. And Volume 1 was so good. And Volume 2, I don't even know what it is, like, what specifically it was about it that just felt like not right. Like, it was, look, see, now TikTok's mad at me because I'm talking shit about reading today.